Before we break into our different teaching groups, I'd love to interview our special guest, George Weiland. Many of you already know George. Yes, welcome, George. Have a seat. You'll be able to tell very quickly that George originally is from Scotland. A lovely accent. He's been in pastoral ministry in the UK, as well as in cross-cultural mission in Brazil. He's served at Carey for 23 years. He set up the Carey Center for Mission Research and Formation. George is married to Jo. They have 3 children, Lindsay, Jonathan, and Joanne. And I believe one little thing that surprised me about George. George, you speak Greek? You know Greek? Right.
Do me much good in Greece.
Right.
Now, anybody that remembers what Greek was 2,000 years before would understand me very well. But that's changed. So I can, however, read the street signs.
Right. And do you know Hebrew as well?
Yeah, enough to get by with reading. Just reading, not speaking.
Yeah, so when George reads the Bible, it's in Hebrew and Greek, the original. That's next level. But George's connection with us is far more personal, because George was instrumental in setting up this church. He, along with others, envisioned a truly multicultural church in Ormiston. And George, here they are, 10 years later. And so, welcome, George. If I may just ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
You're in the spotlight now. So you've had an interesting and adventurous life serving the Lord in the UK, Brazil, and New Zealand. But how did it all begin? How did you come to faith in Jesus?
Okay. There's a few different answers to that, actually, because I think there were different stages. My family, my parents were strong Christians. My dad was at that stage a Pentecostal pastor, so my earliest memories of church are Assemblies of God in the north of Scotland. However, he then accepted a call to a Baptist church, so you could say we moved from spirit to law. I don't know, but that was really shaping my early life. And I was very young. I was about 8, I think, when I first had an experience that I really needed God's forgiveness. And so I asked my mum about it, and she said, well, just pray to Jesus, which of course I did at her knee. And I think something did happen then, but as I got into my teens, a lot of things were up for question, was this real? Was what I had been taught going to be true in my life as well, or was it simply the case that my parents were Christians and so that's what I had to be? And particularly at around that age, about 13, 14, when actually we had migrated. Now, some of you don't believe this is a real cross-cultural migration, but believe me, it was. We moved from Scotland to England. Big difference. Particular, we moved from Glasgow to Yorkshire. And those of you who know the British Isles know that these are 2 quite distinctive cultures. But what happens in migration, as the majority of you know, is that a lot of things become unsettled. New things are discovered. Old things seem to not be fit for purpose anymore. Things change, lots of questions. And I was at a stage where I was really trying to decide, is Jesus real? Because the stakes were very high. I'd seen from the example of my parents that serving Jesus can be very, very costly. You don't have the right to decide your own life anymore. You're asking Jesus what you should do, and what Jesus tells you to do rarely involves a big salary. So at that stage, I'm thinking, if Jesus is real, then I've got to be fully serving him. If he's not real, then, well, let me off the hook. Let me go and do something else. And that was a time of deep searching for me, but it did come to me to the conviction that something happened 2,000 years ago. This man called Jesus was born, ministered in the most remarkable way, died, and then rose again. And if he defeated death, he's still alive. And if he's still alive, he's still the Lord and Savior. And so my commitment then was, yes, I will follow this Jesus. And that's when I was baptized, and began to try and serve God in that way. Well, I mean, I'm 13 and I'm 68 now, so this could be a long story. So I'll stop there and let you get on.
Yeah. So what was it like serving in Brazil? Was it a big culture shock?
Oh man, yes. Yeah. I had when I was about 16, I felt God wants me to be a pastor and serve him. So I did a sensible thing for a 16-year-old. I went and asked for advice of good spiritual people, and the advice was, go and do something else. You're too young. It says, one, if you're going to be a pastor, you've got to have some experience of life. And that was very sensible. Secondly, are you only going to serve God if a church pays you to do it? So get a qualification, get something so that you have a means of income and you're not dependent on people like that. And it'll put it to the test. If you get into something else and you're settled and you find you can serve God and that's fear, fine, stick with that. If you're in something else but still there's that stirring in you and that disquiet, no, this isn't going to be me long term, then, maybe God is nudging you into something else. So I did. I went and did a history degree, taught in high schools for a short time, history and music, but still this stirring was there. And so I then went to train to be a pastor. But I had this thing about, I want to serve God where the resources are limited and least. And this big sense of justice, in Britain, thousands of churches and thousands of pastors. But what about those parts of the world where there are very few? Now, if I were asking that question now, Brazil wouldn't be the place to go because that has exploded in terms of faith over the last generation. But at that time, there was still quite a bit of need, and the Brazilian Baptists were in a collaboration with the British Baptists, and they said, send us people because there is still work to be done. And so, we said, we're up for that. With all the innocence of the ignorance, we'll go. And then we went to Brazil, and sure, it was a shock in all sorts of ways. There was a new language to learn, Portuguese. And I found that although I could study well, that was my thing, I was terrified of making mistakes. And I know, some of you and some of the people who have come as immigrants to New Zealand, you can go for 10 or 20 years terrified to speak because you might not be understood or you might get it wrong. And I was terrified of that. And so I would do my study, and I would learn all this stuff in my head, but terrified of going into a shop and asking for something and getting it wrong, because I did many times, deeply embarrassing. Whereas my wife, Jo, she didn't enjoy the study, but she was very practical. We need to eat, we need bread and milk. She would go out and she would come back with it. Whereas I'd still be trying to write the speech that I would perform. If with time I could tell you some humiliating stories. But that was one of the things, just this feeling of helplessness. More than, it's a different culture. It was, my goodness, I'm not the same person here as I was in a place where I was known, where I'd achieved some things, there was respect. There I was just an ignorant foreigner that people didn't have time for. And I was so envious of the children, 3 and 4-year-olds running around speaking Portuguese. I think, how do you do that? I wish I had that fluency. So having to become a helpless and fairly useless person again for a while until the capacity grew. Culture different, different beneath the surface, different attitudes, different notions of leadership. That was a big one. British Baptists, very, it's the community, it's democratic, there's nobody in charge, you facilitate joint decision making. Brazil, they want to know who's the chefe, who's the chief, who's in charge. And I discovered that we were sent then to minister in the interior of Rondônia, which is a state in the northwest of Brazil. They called it our Wild West country, or what the Brazilians said, the bangi bangi from the Westerners, bang, 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 bang. So it's bangi bangi country. And there was a little church that were beginning to be formed, and I was to be the first pastor. And and straight away, first week, a group of young guys from the church, they had a little wooden house, little wooden hut for the church and a little wooden hut for the pastor next to each other. Somebody had donated an entire tree and they'd sawn it up into a number of logs that they could build that thing with. And so this building was already looking a bit shabby. And so these young folks turned up and said, "Pastor, we've come to paint the church." I said, "Brilliant, excellent, you carry on, but we need you to tell us what colour." I thought, me? Why ask me? I'm the new kid on the block, I've just arrived, I don't know what's appropriate. I said, no, you decide. I'm also thinking I'm actually teaching them ecclesiology here, congregational government, it's not just I do. So, and so they said, no, Pastor, you tell us. So I thought, okay, they're looking for a lead, what do I say? And it was painted a kind of cream colour, I think. I mean, I didn't, admit I'm actually colourblind, but not equipped by the Spirit for this task. But I said, I thought a safe thing is to be the same colour again, just freshen it up. So, cream, love that colour, cream, let's do that. Sure, you're the pastor, you're in charge. Off they went, nothing happened to the church. Next day they're back, "Pastor, we've come to paint the church." She said, yeah, I thought we agreed, carry on, but we need you to tell us what colour. Okay, cream, so we said, I think it's my language, creme, muito bonita, and then, okay, yeah, you're the pastor, off they went, nothing happened. When they came back a third day, I'm thinking, I've got to learn something here. I can lead so long as I lead in the direction they want to go. So I knew I'd tried saying, what colour do you think? Oh no, it's not for us to say. Instead I said, I'm new in this town. There are one or two churches. What colours do they use for churches? Answer, well, that church has a really nice blue colour, but I'm not saying we should do that. I said, blue, what a great idea. I think we should paint it blue. I said, okay, Pastor, you're in charge. And the next day it was painted. So, blue. So that was a kind of deeper cultural thing about, great respect for the pastor provided. And that was not too different to Yorkshire, actually. A church leader in Yorkshire told me the way to lead in Yorkshire, find out where everybody's going and walk in front. There were other cultural things as well, but
that gives us a glimpse. Now, many of us are from countries and cultures where Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam are the predominant religions.
Yeah.
When we become Christians, to what extent do we need to give up aspects of our home culture? For example, as a Christian, I wouldn't celebrate the Indian festival of Diwali because it's connected to Hinduism. So can you speak to what extent do Christians need to give up parts of their home culture in order to be Christian? Or do they not?
I think there is not one answer to that. There are circumstances. The question is, how do I faithfully follow Jesus in the condition that I'm in. Remember, Paul said to the Corinthians, who had many different cultures and backgrounds, and they're saying, what should we do? They're wrong, we're right. And Paul said, look, just in the condition in which you were when you were saved, live in that. Now, admittedly, there will be some things that obviously you say, no, I'm not doing that anymore. But when in Romans and Corinthians, we get the churches asking Paul, give us some guidance here. There's this group that is observing all the Jewish culture, there's this group that is doing things completely different. There are these people that quite happily go into the temple to buy their meat because that's where it's all butchered, and this other group that says, we don't eat meat at all because it might be tainted by sacrifice. And Paul's answer is, respect one another. Receive one another in love. Don't let anybody else dictate to your conscience, but don't let your freedom destroy somebody else's conscience. So it's relational. It's faithfulness to God, and then the question, how is my behavior affecting the people around me? And so, for example, in Brazil, we had got to our first Christmas there, and there was no electric lights anyway. It was just, gas lights or whatever. But I was thinking, hey, wouldn't it be nice to have candles for Christmas and all these candles and different colors? But there was one young Brazilian missionary, a woman who was visiting us, and she was horrified because we had red candles, red and white. And she was like, no, you can't have that. And it turned out she'd been a medium in Umbanda, which is a kind of Afro-Brazilian spiritist religion. And for her, red candles are what you use when you're trying to invoke the devil. And so she said, we can't have that. And so, oh, God, well, sure, no, okay. No red candles then. We won't do that. But, back here, very few people here see a red candle and think, oh, there's the devil. Most of them think, that's a pretty colour, that's appropriate for Christmas. So I said, it's not like, is there a rule? Christians don't use red candles. But there's a relational command. Don't cause another believer to stumble because of what you do. And same question about whether you go into a temple. I spoke with I got to know a Christian in India that visited a few times, and he was Christian, but pretty well everybody that he knew outside the little Christian group was Hindu. And he wanted to reach out to the Hindu community, and there were some pretty hardline folk there as well. And so he got to know them. He was a local school teacher, and a lot of respect for his care. That was the thing, the care for the students, which wasn't all that common. There was a job to do. I teach you, you go away. But it's caring for them, for their families, gained respect. And then got to the point where he could talk to some of the leaders and say, I would love to give you a gift of the Christian scriptures. And they accepted it very happily. And then got to Easter and says, hey, we have a special celebration of Jesus, and I'd like to invite you. And they came. But then it got to Krishna's birthday, Lord Krishna, a Hindu god. And they're saying to him, hey, it's a Krishna celebration. We'd love you to come. And he told me he's weighing this up. Is it just okay for them to come into my space without me going into their space? And so he said, so I went out of relationship. And I mean, worship happens a bit differently, but everybody's sitting there, and then there's singing and chanting, and he says, and they're singing and praying to Krishna, and I'm singing and praying to Jesus. It's okay, and they know that I'm a Jesus worshipper, but they appreciate that I'm coming into their space as a guest, because that honors them. And he said, and they're much more willing to listen to me because they see that I'm listening to them. Whereas for others, new Christians in that area, some of them would be told, although don't go to the Krishna stuff because you're still very close to that. And it might tip you over the edge in terms of where your allegiance really lies. So it's situational, it's relational, it's a matter of not judging others, but helping each other to walk faithfully with Jesus.
No. That's great, George. OCBC has multiple cultures.
Yes.
Why was it so important to be one multicultural church rather than, say, a Cambodian church, a Chinese church?
Yeah.
Why is multiculturalism in the church so important?
I think it's crucially important for God, for the world, and for us. For God, because what we see in Scripture, in the story of Scripture, is God calling the nations together into one people. And even in the Old Testament, you get Israel, but the instructions they're given are receive the migrant, the one who arrives, welcome them in. Live among the nations in such a way that the nations are attracted to your God. In the New Testament, we see time and again this conviction coming through that the people of God are of every nation and tribe, of every culture. And for the glory of God, when we are worshipping in that way, there is something that honors God. That we look round each other and in our hearts we say, God, you are the Lord not only of people like me, but of people like all those others who are here. You're a much bigger God than the God of my tribe. You're the God of all nations. So for our understanding of God, in fact, Paul says in one of his letters that it's God's will that through the church, the wisdom of God will be made known. How does the world know what God is like other than by seeing the people of God and what they are like? And do we want, and this is where I move on to the second bit, for the world, do we want people to see God as a white God of a white community, or a multicultural God who made all cultures and peoples and loves them all? That if we can say that, but people don't accept it if they hear it, they accept it if they see it. I had a neighbour when we lived in East Auckland for some time, and this neighbour, nothing to do with church, very hostile actually to it, but she had also moved into the house next door to ours because, I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but she didn't want to live next to foreigners. I mean, she got us, but this is a strange thing in New Zealand, that if you're from somewhere like Britain, you're an honorary Kiwi from the moment you hit the tarmac coming in. But if you're different to the majority culture, you can have been here for generation upon generation, and there are people who still think that really you should go back to somewhere else. But anyway, that's an aside. But I was at the time involved with the global community at the Auckland Tabernacle, which is people of many, many different nationalities, cultures, and languages. And she was in with us. She says, I just don't think it works. It doesn't work for different cultures to be together. They don't get on. And I was thinking, well, if you were to come with me on Sunday morning, which of course she never would, but if you were, you would be immersed in a joyful and rich and loving and real community of difference rather than sameness. So for the witness, and that's especially the case in a nation like New Zealand that is becoming increasingly multicultural. And then for us as people who are part of a multicultural church, yeah, there are things you've got to get used to. Yes, sometimes it can be a bit tricky. Sometimes there's misunderstanding, all of that. But the enrichment is profound in terms of our faith. Those of us who are more kind of white Western, for a couple of 100 years, our surrounding culture has been one of secularism, where you separate the spiritual from anything real. And it's very hard you can say, I affirm that God is at work in the world, but to feel it and to know it, that's difficult for people who are in a very materialistic, scientific worldview. We need the testimonies like we heard today from our sister. We need the experience of those who say, well, we need to talk to God about this. And I have time for another story. I'll cut the sermon short. In fact, it feels like this is already the sermon. Just an example I had in Nepal, actually. I was teaching in a little college in Nepal, new Christians, very new country in terms of Christian faith. So 25 students who wanted to be pastors and missionaries, all of them first generation from Hindu and Buddhist and animist backgrounds, except for one girl whose mum and dad were already Nepali pastors. And one day I was in the college, I was in the top floor, which was the guest bedroom, and lots of people downstairs in the dormitory, just young folks clowning around, as they do. And there was one guy that's a particular clown. Abraham was his given name when he was baptized. Krishna was his birth name. I won't go down that side alley, but what name do you adopt when you become Christian? And his pastor gave him the name Abraham because you need a Christian name. Later, he said, no, I need to return to my birth name to show that even people from a Hindu background can be followers of Jesus. But anyway, that was a bit of a distraction. And I had this scream, this terrible scream. And I'm thinking, oh no, what's going on? Is there a demonic attack somewhere? And I'd better go and see. So there were about 14 flights of steps, and I'm running down the flights of steps, when two young girl students came running up, and they're saying, oh, Dr. George, you must come. And I said, I'm on my way, what is it? Down I go, and there's Abraham. And he'd been swinging on the door to his dormitory, a big, heavy wooden door. The door had slammed shut, and he trapped his fingers. His mate, his friend, was on the other side of the door, heard Abraham screaming and thought, oh, he's just clowning about. And so he pushed the door tighter. So, oh my goodness. And so there was poor Abraham just sort of trembling with shock and holding up this munted hand. And he's a guitar player, and we'd been kind of jamming together. And his first thing was, I won't be able to play guitar. Look at my fingers. And I said, oh, he's in shock. What do we need? We need to put a blanket over him. There's no medicine at all in the college because they can't afford. If somebody was sick, they went off to the market to buy one aspirin. That's all they could afford at one time. So I had, my travel kit. I said, no, I've got medicine. I can go and get it. And I'll just go. Just wait. I'll be back as quick as I can. And then one of the girls, 17-year-old, the one whose parents were Nepali pastors, she said to me, she was also Brahmin by birth, born to control and to lead. And so she said, Dr. George, thank you for the offer of medicine. We will be grateful to receive it, but that is not why we called you. We want you to pray. I thought, it's easier to give you a paracetamol. But I thought, okay, I feel rebuked, but okay. So I put my arms around Abraham and I prayed as fervently as I could for what I hoped was a sufficient length of time to persuade them that I really was serious about this. And then I said, okay, wait. And then I shot up the stairs, came back down with my paracetamol and said, okay, so take this. And Abraham looks up, cheerful as anything, holds up this hand that looks perfectly normal, and said, oh, I don't need it anymore. I'm healed. And of course, the Nepali new Christians were not surprised at all. How else are you going to get healing when you can't afford an aspirin? Me, I realized in that moment, I was offering, for all my spiritual years, and knowledge, I was offering the resources of Western wealth and science. I was saying, look, okay, The problem is you don't have medicine. I need them. I've got it. I'll give it to you. And what they gave me was the gift of the faith of the poor. And that really struck me, and it's struck me since, and affected how I believe. I still believe that medicine is also a gift of God, and that we should accept it gratefully. But it's not instead of prayer; it's as part of our trusting in God.
It's amazing how we can learn from different cultures. Last question,
Okay.
George. You've now journeyed with the Lord for what, 55 years? Something like that?
Did I say I was 40 when I became a Christian? Yes. At least, yes.
What is one spiritual discipline that you've kind of built your life around that helps you feel connected with God?
Well, I know spiritual practices are much talked about today, and there's all sorts of different ones. But I'm kind of a bread and butter person. I read the Bible and pray. That's primarily what I do. And I started doing that at 13, 14. I got baptized. I thought, right, I've really got to be serious about reading the Bible now. And my dad gave me this sort of method of reading the whole Bible in a year, I think. Well, it actually took me 7 years, because I would read a bit and then I would think, and there were some questions. It took a long, because I was doing that to try to get to know the Bible. The thing was, once I'd done that, now about 2021, I think, well, I've done the Bible, what do I do next? And I thought, maybe I didn't catch everything first time around, I'd better go through it again. So I did. And I found that, although I've used different ways of reading and different at first it was reading basically for the information I need to know. After that, increasingly, now I rarely read something that I've never read before in the Bible. Although occasionally there are still things I think I know, and then when I actually look at it, I said, oh, but I missed that bit. But increasingly what I'm reading, what I find myself reading for, is basically what God is speaking to me about in this day and in this situation. And and I follow a pattern. It's not just a random open the Bible, what am I going to read? Ta-da, this one. But I read through sequentially. I tend to read a psalm in the morning, a psalm at night, to try and focus my first thoughts on God and my last thoughts. But when I read for meditation, for prayer, it's what am I learning, and how do I enter into the kind of life and experience out of which those biblical writers have spoken, and how do I enter into the life of the people of God that is expressed in those ways.
Wonderful. Well, George, can I pray for you before you bring us the word? Lord Jesus, thank you for George. Thank you for calling him at the tender age of 13, when he made you his Lord and Savior. And he's taken, Lord, that commitment to follow you seriously. And he has followed you to Brazil, to Nepal, to New Zealand. And what a rich and adventurous journey it has been with you, Lord. Thank you for the many seeds he has scattered around the world. Thank you for the lives that he has touched. Thank you for his scholarship, especially about the mission of God, the Missio Dei. And today, Lord, as he brings us the word, may it be as thus saith the Lord. We come expectant, Lord, to hear you through George. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
And George, I'd just like to give you a little koha as a token of our appreciation for being here. Let's thank you.
Thank you. I love Santhosh's multicultural and careful negotiation of different cultures. And I just asked him, so when do you finish? And he tapped his watch and said, oh, basically take as long as you like, 20 minutes. So, good. Hey, can I say thank you so much for the invitation to come here and for the opportunity to come and share with you. There have been so many people here that I've known from our time living in East Auckland and involved with Eastview Baptist Church, from Carey College, some of you who have studied there, from even near neighbours on the street we used to live on. And it is a real delight to be here, to have the opportunity for the first time actually to be in Sunday worship with this wonderful group. And it's been a privilege to accompany this process for a number of years. My part in it was, just chipping in from the side, really, being involved in some conversations at different points, and particularly maybe talking about the value of being intentionally multicultural for the glory of God and for the witness to the nations and for the enrichment of the people of God. And it's wonderful to see how that is eventuating. What I'd like to do today is briefly, and within the 18 minutes remaining, to ask the question, how do we approach the mission task of the church in what is a very special place and special community? Ormiston is different to much of New Zealand. And one of the ways in which it's different is the extent to which this and the surrounding areas have become home to people who have come from many places. And if people come from elsewhere, then they come as immigrants. And that means they come with vulnerability, and they come with culture shock, and they come with a sense of gain, a new place, but a deep sense of loss of what has been before. And it can also be the case that migration precipitates crisis in families and in communities. And one of the ways in which it does that is that people who have been leaders in the home country find that they're not looked to for the same kind of leadership in the new place. And partly that is because in the church context, when they come to try and join a church, they find that not only is their value not appreciated, there's no attempt to look for it. The assumption is, it's our job, by our, the majority culture, it's our job to welcome people in, but we're not expecting them to run the church, or even to make any contribution to it. And that's why a multicultural church is crucial for receiving in with respect and with honor those who come from elsewhere. I'd better give my examples from other cities, just so you know, but a church in Wellington. I went to do a church weekend, a camp, and it was mainly white people down in Wellington, a lot of government employees and so on. But there was one Korean family, a couple, and a little daughter. And we were in groups supposed to be discussing, how can the church be welcoming and make people feel at home? And so I was in this group, and one very jaded kind of civil servant type of saying, well, what makes me feel welcome in church is when I'm not asked to do anything. I'm so busy all week, and I get there on Sunday, and if the pastor gets up and says, we have work to do, my heart sinks. And he says, we need volunteers to do this, and we need people in charge of that, and he says, I go away more burdened than when I arrived, And various people were kind of, yeah, that's resonating. We're too busy, and if the pastor puts pressure on us to do anything, and the pastor had told me I never ask for volunteers, or I never shoulder tap anybody because don't put them under pressure. But I knew that the Korean couple, they were not saying anything. And as far as the pastor knew, they were just this foreign family that was on the fringe of church life, that'd been there a couple of years. And so I knew also that I couldn't ask a direct question, like, what do you think? Oh no, I can't give an answer. It's not for me to say. But they can talk about something else. So I said, tell me, in Korea, what do churches do to make people feel welcome? And the woman, the wife, started talking. And she said, well, we know we're welcome when the pastor asks us to do something. Completely different. And the pastor is saying, I don't want to put pressure on these new immigrants. They'll feel embarrassed. They won't. Whereas they're just waiting and waiting for an opportunity to serve. And the man came in then and said, well, yes, just recently I did feel welcome because the pastor did ask for help. He said, we're going to serve our community. We're going to go along the riverbank and we're going to pick up all the rubbish. We need help. And so I went along and I was given gloves and a black bag and I went along picking up rubbish and I was so happy because I was serving. And I thought, oh my goodness. And then the wife said, of course, my husband is very well qualified in theology and education. And in our church of several thousand people in Korea, he was the director of the teaching ministry and an elder and a leader. And, I thought, oh my goodness. So he's come with all that experience. But in the largely Kiwi church, he's regarded as a visitor who probably doesn't understand much and who certainly, give them a smile, but don't expect anything from them. What a tragedy. It's just an example of the church in New Zealand needs help, right? And God is bringing the help. In the UK, I was back in January and visited a church I'd known years ago as a lad, and now it's half African. And I was at a mission conference led by the group of African missionaries to Europe. And one well-known writer on church and church growth and these sort of things has made this observation about Britain. He said, Christians in Britain have prayed for generations for revival. And when it came, they didn't recognize it because it was black. And it's true. They did not appreciate and welcome the gift that God was giving to the church. And so what's happening there is that, of course, the various African groups have to start their own churches, like the West Indians 2 generations before, because they're not welcomed into the... Now that is changing. It's changing a lot. I was on a Zoom call a couple of nights ago with the UK network of intercultural church, and things are changing such a lot because people are realizing this isn't the church in the UK is being burdened by lots of people coming in. It's the UK is being blessed and helped because of the rich resources that God is bringing in. And I think the same is true here in New Zealand. And Ormiston is special because there are diverse languages and cultures. Some see that as a problem. I see it as a wonderful, wonderful gift and opportunity. And it's different from most of New Zealand. Just let me show what I mean. This is a little chart to show the proportions, the percentages of the total population of New Zealand that are made up of different ethnic groups. European, basically the white people in New Zealand, is now about 69% of New Zealand as a whole. A couple of generations ago, it was 90-odd%, but it's been reducing. Maori, now about 17-18%, maybe even higher now. These figures are from a year or two ago. Pacific people, something in the 8 or 9%. Asian, about 17%. Now, got to apologise for that category, because this is from the government statistics agency, Stats New Zealand, and this is how they categorise people from way back. Asian includes Indian and Chinese and Malaysian and Taiwan and Cambodia, and so it's a big category. And sooner or later they're going to have to split it because it's too broad, really. But of that, about 17-18% of New Zealand's population would now be identified as Asian. And then other is Middle East, Latin America, Africa, anywhere else in the world. Born overseas, however, over a quarter of New Zealand's population was born in other countries, which is quite high in terms of international standards. And so a quarter of the people that you will meet anywhere in New Zealand are likely to have been born somewhere else. Now, that's New Zealand. Here's Ormiston Flatbush area. Things are a bit different, eh? European, 70%, 69 nation, and about 21% here. Less than a quarter of the population of this immediate area is European. Maori, a little bit less than the population as a whole, about 6% there. Pacific, a little bit more. Thanks, Nevin. I'm keeping up the averages. But Asian, 70%. So nearly 3/4 of this region would be considered Asian in one or other of those Asian ethnicities. A few more others than you get elsewhere. But the born overseas, over 60%, something like 62% were born overseas. So the majority of people that you will bump into in this were not born in New Zealand, which means they've come from elsewhere with all that we've talked about in terms of vulnerability and loss of status and the difficulties of negotiating life in a new place. That's their experience. That's the experience of most of the people that you will see when you walk over into the new Ormiston town centre, and in the sports fields and everything else. So just putting the two together, that shows the contrast. And the point is made by the graph. This area is not typical. It's different. And a mission implication, what works for New Zealand as a whole can't be expected to work here. Things have to be different, because in effect, this is a different cultural mix, a different demographic, a different population mix to that in New Zealand as a whole. And so when it comes to the question of church planting and of witness, how may we make Jesus known in this special place that is new and diverse and different? You're in a mission front line here. There are lots of churches in New Zealand that are saying, hey, do you realize things are changing around us? We've got to come up with new ways of being the church that are appropriate, not to a monocultural group, but to a multicultural population. And what you are negotiating, working out, living out with each other here is something that a lot of other churches are going to be looking at to say, is it possible? Can it be done? What are the problems? What are the gains? So please continue with what you're doing, not only for this church, not only for this community, but for the nation that needs to know how to live well as the people of Jesus Christ in multicultural contexts. When we raise that question, it becomes, what do you imagine? This was a church plant. What do you imagine when you think church? I think my slides have got a wee bit out of sync here. Here we go. This is Mongolia. I don't know if there's anybody from Mongolia here. Not one of those high proportions of immigrants to New Zealand. But we were there, Joe and I were there a little while back, and these big round tents, that's what you see all over the place. That's the traditional dwelling, the yurt or ger, they call it there. And the reason that they're in tents is that most people have, until the last few years, most people have been nomads. They travel from place to place. And they travel from place to place because they are herders. They have animals of various sorts, horses, yaks, and sheep, goats, and they can't stay in one place. Mongolia has harsh weather conditions, so they have to move. When you can actually see the grass, when the ice melts enough, then you feed up your animals so that they can get through the winter, and many of them don't. So they keep on the move, and that's been the tradition. And now some of them are moving into the city. We were in Ulaanbaatar, the capital, but even then, they're in yurt suburbs. Just men, hundreds of these, and reaching up on the hills and so on. So this is the tradition. And while we were there, I asked, could I go and see a Mongolian church made up of indigenous Mongolian people, because a number were becoming Christians. And so I was taken to this. And you might think, what has that got to do with Mongolia? I mean, we know it's a church, because there are churches like that all over the world, and it's basically a brick building with a cross on the front, and inside, very different. In the yurt, it's circular, and people sit or sleep round the walls of the tent. In the middle, there's the cooking, there's different things that happen. There are ways of behaving in a yurt. You know, you don't just run in. You have to go in and go round in a particular way so that you don't bang into other people. Your hospitality works in a particular way. And that's just where people are comfortable, and they sit round and they talk and so on. And there was the church I was taken to had begun meeting in a yurt. It's still there, just out of picture, almost on the right. But the missionaries' home church, and I just want to let our friends, the Americans, off the hook here. It wasn't one of them. But the missionaries' home church had decided, oh my goodness, you're so poor, you're still having to meet in an old tent. You need a proper building. We can do something about that. And so they raised the money, and they arranged for the materials, and they sent over a building team from the church, and they built the church. And so now it's a proper church. And when you go inside, it's not seating round in a circle, it's in pews, pointed to the front, there's a platform, there's a keyboard, there's a lectern, It's become a proper church. My question that unfortunately I didn't get the chance to ask because it would have been insensitive to ask the leaders there, at which stage in this church's life do you think it was most likely that they were able to relate well to local people and invite them to be part of what they're doing as worshippers of Jesus? But I'm pretty sure it was when they were in the yurt, because that's where everybody was. I said, come into our yurt and learn our stuff. But when you put up a building like that in that context, you're erecting another barrier, a cultural barrier. What, you want me to go into that building? I've never been in one of those. Oh no, but this is where we worship God and we hear His word. Okay, but before you get in there, you've already had to cross cultural barriers that are unnecessary. And I put that up there, as I say, there may well be reasons. There's a lot of building going on in Mongolia now because life is changing. Maybe they're just ahead of the game. But in terms of a new church, it's not a matter of saying, well, we know what a church looks like and what a church does, because our old church Well, we learn from that. Isn't it a matter of saying, how do the people in this community gather? What would remove any barriers to them engaging with, relating to the Jesus followers who are here? And it's difficult when you get to a building, it is. It can be a wonderful resource, but it can also inadvertently be a further barrier to people who see something that looks unfamiliar or strange and think, have I got to go in there? And so I do pray that you'll have wisdom in that. And I do congratulate you as a church on waiting a decade before putting up a building. Because when you start with that, you put up a building and you say, right, the job of the mission of the church is to fill this building with people. And when you've done that, job done. Congratulations. Whereas the mission of the church is not to fill a building, but to infiltrate a whole area, a whole region with the grace of God. And if a building can serve that, that's wonderful. So anyway, I'll return to Athens rather than Mongolia, because we read about Athens in the Bible, in the New Testament, as a place that Paul, the apostle, found himself. And there's some points of connection with this area. Many foreign visitors in Athens. A place, a destination for travelers, for people who were interested in all sorts of things, who wanted to study, who wanted to see the phenomenal buildings of Athens. There were diverse religions and philosophies. The place was heaving with little temples and big temples and shrines and worship going on. And it was quite different from most of the places where Paul and his team had already been. Some overlap with some other places, but Athens was different. For them it was new. And so Paul couldn't do just the same thing that he'd done everywhere. What was he going to be able to do in that context? We'll read, and this is Acts chapter 17, verse 16. So while Paul was waiting for them, that's for his team in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, that was a council that decided on religious matters, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting? You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears. We'd like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. So that's a little comment by Luke, the author of Acts, that says, strange people, the Athenians, a bit different. So how do you begin to make Jesus known in such a context? Well, learn from Paul. First, he opened his eyes. First thing that's said, while they were in Athens, Paul looked around. It maybe doesn't seem like very exciting mission work, but it's crucial. And it's crazy to start anything else before you've done that. Paul went and looked around. And later in his speech to that group, he tells them, "As I've gone through the city, I've looked very carefully. I've studied what I've seen. I've looked at your temples and your shrines and your objects of worship." He really wanted to know. He opened his eyes to learn. And that's the first challenge in a multicultural place. Just to look and learn. Just to observe. Just to walk around or sit in a cafe or on the bench and just look. And see and open your mind to see and learn new things. Many people don't even realize that they live in a multicultural area because they see what they know. and they don't see what is strange. Open your eyes to strange things and learn to understand rather than, oh my goodness, they're all wrong. It's, well, what is it about their worship? What is it about their desire to have this connection with the divine, the spiritual? And opened his heart to care. It says there Paul was disturbed. He emotionally disturbed to see all this worship and all those gods. But do you know what that means? It means that he cared. They mattered. It wasn't a matter of indifference. He wasn't sailing through like a tourist saying, oh my goodness, isn't this funny? Look at all these gods, look at all those temples. Hey ho. Well, where's the next destination on the tour of cities of Greece? He saw it and his heart was engaged. He cared. And we can ask God to soften our hearts to care. Sometimes that involves taking on board the pain of what we see and distress. But that shows that there's an emotional engagement and commitment. And then he opened his mouth. Opened his eyes to learn, opened his heart to care, opened his mouth to speak. And that's the difficult bit for many of us. But he started with folk of his own culture. Did you notice it said he went to the synagogue where there are Jews? He's Jewish. So he started with, where in this great, big, overwhelming city of so much difference and divergence, oh, look, there's a Jewish group. Well, I'm Jewish. I can connect with them. And he sought out people like himself. Not yet followers of Jesus, but he could talk to them. And they would understand him, and he was on the same page. That's a good place to start as well. Another advantage of a multicultural church is that it might be 20 or 30 different cultural identities. And so between us, we can cover quite a lot just by making an effort to connect well with people who are like us. And so he talked with them, but it wasn't only them. He then went and hung out in the marketplace, just in the streets, just in the town square, and he just talked to random people who happened to be there. And this wasn't so targeted. It wasn't like, it's like, okay, I'm a Scot, so I'm moving in here. I must find the Scottish community of Ormiston and try and talk to them about Jesus, because they'll understand my accent. It's not only that, it's, well, bump into people. But how do you bump into people? Well, you put yourself in the place where interactions happen. Just be around, open to God for connections, relationships, communication. And then the opportunity came to give a more reasoned, a more determined explanation of Jesus and salvation when he was invited to talk to the Areopagus, the council. So this is what happened there. Paul stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you're ignorant of the very thing that you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." Paul's approach, it starts with respect. We know how Paul felt. He was deeply disturbed that people were worshipping so many gods. But that's not where he starts in communicating with those people. It's not, "I've had a look at this city and it's a disgrace. You know, you're all a load of heathen, you pagans, you're worshipping the wrong gods, and you're going to be judged, so you'd better look out." That wasn't his approach. Instead it was, "Hey folks, you are so religious. You're so spiritual. You're so concerned to worship the right God in the right way. So respect to you, because you really are serious about this. And can you respect and honor the spiritual quest of people who have not yet arrived at a knowledge of Jesus? It's not just a matter of, what religion are you? Not Christian? Well, you're wrong. It's, oh, this is interesting. So what are you seeking? How does your faith and religious practice matter to you? And I respect you that you are so serious about this. And then interest, he shows knowledge of their religious practice. I see what you've done. I see how you worship. And he's also able to speak using the words of their sacred texts, their prophets. You know, in him we live and move and have our being. And we are all God's offspring. Paul is quoting what many of the people in Athens would have affirmed. He says, that's what we believe. We believe there was a creator God, and we all come from this creator God. And in fact, you know, God is the source of life. And so there's already so much that they can actually agree on before he gets to the new revelation that is coming in Jesus. So the good news speaks into their spiritual reality of desiring to know the right and the true God. He goes on. So, accepting that we all, and many of them say, yeah, there's a God who made the world. Okay, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and doesn't live in temples built by human hands, and he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives life to everyone, life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. And God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. See how much he agrees with before he gets to the point of difference. He affirms many of their own beliefs. It's not a total black and white. I'm all right and you're all wrong. But you're already so near the faith that I share. And let's affirm that. God is the creator. God is the source of life. God made all nations, gave them their places to live. God is near us and we are God's children. And there's also a confidence that God wants to be known and is stirring people to reach out to him. So he says, therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, to change, to turn around in their thinking and in their lives. For he set a day on which he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. And he has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. What Paul's doing? He's reasoning. He takes what they already believe about God and then uses that to challenge where their ways of worshipping him are missing the mark. You say that God is everywhere and we all exist in God. Well, so how can you put God in a building? How can you put him in a stone idol or a temple? You can't do it because God's bigger than that. He calls to change. Not just, well, this has been an interesting chat, folks. We've shared our understandings and we'll see you next week. It's more, okay, so take seriously this God who is making himself known. He does call for change. Change from what we've been to what we can be. Change from the ways we view and regarded God to the way we now see God in Jesus. And he introduces Jesus, God's ruler who will judge the world and who has been raised from the dead. Now, that was the point at which there was going to be real disagreement. And so it was. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. Others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. And at that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of this council, Areopagus, also a woman called Damaris, many others. So what about the response that Paul got? And the responses that we can expect as we begin or continue to engage with people who are very different in a context such as this. Paul actually got a lot of curiosity. When he was talking in the marketplace, there are folks who said, what's he saying? What's this about? There were others who said, we need to know more about this. This is reasonably interesting. There's more curiosity than we might expect. Sometimes we can be very reluctant to talk to people about our Christian faith because we don't want to, what people often say to me, I don't want to push my beliefs down their throats. No, you don't want to do that, because they wouldn't stay breathing for very long if you did that. But there can be a curiosity that we don't actually give credit for. People want to know. They are interested. Again, it's more so some other places, in India, in Nepal, in Brazil. Very common question. So what's your religion? A Pakeha New Zealander would never ask somebody that, because that's private. You don't talk about these things any more than I would tell you how much I earn or what's the current state of my mortgage. That's private. That's for me. Whereas, these things were also asked about in Brazil. Oh, how much did you pay for that? How much did you get paid? What's in your cupboard? But just open and curiosity. What's your belief? Said, oh, I'm Christian. What kind of Christian? Oh, in a Baptist church. Oh, that's interesting. I'm Umbanda. I'm Spiritist, and conversations strike up. More difficult with the kind of Western people. But there's a lot of curiosity that people genuinely are interested. And many of the people who come to New Zealand come expecting and hoping that they're going to learn about Christian faith, because it's a Christian country. I better finish soon, eh? Yeah, I shall. So I'll finish with a story. Hold that thought, okay? Some ridicule. You will get it. Paul got it. But that's not necessarily the end of the story. The man who was the senior church leader, the deacon in the church we were planting, an old rural Brazilian, and he told me that as to how did you become a follower of Jesus? He said, well, through laughing at a missionary. Oh. He said he was out in the bush, out in the wops, and they heard that, some 10 kilometers away or something, there was going to be a meeting. Now, nothing else happened. No radio, no TV, no shows or whatever. So when something was on, everybody gathered round. So he and his mates, he was a young man, said, let's go and have a look at this. So they went to where this meeting was, and this was an American missionary who had struggled with the Portuguese language, but he was there in the jungle, with them and trying to teach them. But his grammar was wrong and his pronunciation was, and they were just laughing. And on the way home, they were making fun of him. And then as Bispo left his friends and walked off through the path, he's thinking, that guy's a fool, isn't he? And wasn't it funny the way that he thought he was talking about the devil, the diabo, but he talked about the diaba, which is the female devil, and said, you mustn't go with the female devil. And he thought, I don't know, that sounds quite attractive. And, so they were laughing away. But then it suddenly struck him like a thunderbolt. Why is he doing this? Why is he coming from a comfortable place where he's already got a respected job, and he's coming here, where it's difficult, life is difficult, and he's being laughed at by people like me? Why is he doing it? He must really mean this. And furthermore, I think the way I'm going in my life, I am going with the devil. Maybe I should change. And he did. Such an encouragement to me when I was learning the language and thinking my preaching will have no effect because I can get the grammar wrong. For Bispo to say, no, it's like the very fact that this guy was so vulnerable as to put himself in the place where he would be laughed at in order to share a message that really mattered to him. That's what God used. Initial misunderstanding. What's he talking about? Oh, he's talking about two gods. One of them is called Jesus, one of them is called Anastasia, resurrection. I think we know about that God. Well, of course there were misunderstanding, but you get that as well. It takes a long time for things to come through. But some seriously considered and some became believers. So, making Jesus known in this special community. Learn from Paul, look, listen, and learn. Have conversations, show respect and interest, affirm beliefs and hopes that we share. Introduce Jesus and be confident that God's already present. As Paul said, looking out over the city of Athens, God has appointed the places where all these people are and are now. And can we say that? God has appointed the places where all the people of this area are now living. They're there. God is not taken by surprise. God knows they are there, and indeed, some of them are able to testify, we know that God brought us here so that we could seek him and know him. And the story I'll finish with a young Chinese woman called Grace. At least she was called Grace when I met her and heard her story. She was brought up in a regime that's atheist and quite clever at school, but she was told, no religion, nothing spiritual, etc. But there was a yearning, a real yearning to know. And she wanted to know if there was a God, and if so, what difference this God made, because her life, she just couldn't see a point in it. She was quite young still, but she persuaded her parents to let her move to New Zealand to study. And the reason the parents agreed was, well, yeah, if you can study in an English language context, that might be helpful for a job, and then you can buy us an apartment and look after us in our old age, very pragmatic. Yep, you get yourself along there. And I haven't even given the altar call, man. You're ready. Sorry. And I won't be giving one anyway. So, but no, the real reason she told me was she wanted to come to New Zealand to find God. She thought that if she goes to a Christian country, she'll find God. Now she was shocked. She came to study at the university. Her first term went by, first semester. It was dismal. She struggled in class, didn't find God, couldn't find friends. Student accommodation, she was on her own, lonely, desperately lonely. And she thought, there's no point. I've made a big mistake. And she told me, I got to the point where it was Sunday and no uni to go to, so I decided, I've had enough of this. I'm going to end my life today. Because I don't know what's happened to me, but my life is just a mess. So I'll try a prayer. We're talking about just a prayer. And her prayer went along the lines of, I don't know if there's a God, and if there's a God, I don't know who you are, but you got to give me something. Give me a sign, or else that's it. I'm going to take my life. And then, bizarrely, she thought, I may as well go and buy a packet of biscuits before I end my life. And she got in the lift to go down and stopped at the next level. Another Chinese girl got in, also a student. Turned out they were from the same part of China, had the same dialect, they spoke, and began speaking together. And this other girl had said, what are you doing? And she said, I was just going to buy something to eat. Said, so am I. Let's get something and come back to my apartment and we can share lunch. So said, okay. Did that, got food, went back, had a real nice time, human connection. And she was beginning already to feel a bit better. But then this new friend said, hey, it's evening time, and I actually go to a church on Sunday evenings. Just people that come and, pray, worship Jesus, and I thought, no pressure, but would you like to come? Yes! Yes, I'll come. And she's beginning to think, is this my sign? And so along they went, and the guy who was preaching, I know the person who was preaching, although I didn't get the story from him, but from the girl. And he just gave a very sort of simple, reasoned explanation of the gospel. And then at the end he says, so is there anybody who wants to accept Jesus? Me! Yes. And it was real. And when I knew her, which was just maybe 2 or 3 years later, she was, finishing her uni studies, and then she was going to go off to Bible college because she wanted to be a missionary. But the thing that really hit me was there was somebody who had come to this country seeking God. And most people, including most Christians who came across her, would have thought, I'd better not talk to her because she's different, and I don't want to impose my belief. She's desperate to know. And the challenge to me has been, could I be that sort of friend to people like Grace? Because who knows what God is already doing in their heart and life. Hey friends, you've been very patient. It's been a while since I was here. It'll be a longer time before I'm invited back, but thank you for your hospitality and for your attention. And God bless you as you come across the curious people whom God has brought here to seek him and perhaps even to find him.